Welcome to boring history for sleep, where the faint glow of torchlight dances on ancient stone walls, and the soft clink of goblets in a distant hall weaves tales so gentle they cradle you into a restful slumber. Imagine yourself wrapped in a warm blanket, the air heavy with the scent of old parchment and smouldering oak, as we wander through the scandal-filled corridors of medieval courts, where kings wore their crowns with pride but their hearts with reckless abandon. Before we slip into the shadows of history, please give this video a like if these soothing stories ease your night. Subscribe to join our quiet journeys through the past, and drop a comment to share where you ray drifting off from and what time it is there. Now settle into the stillness, let the world melt away, and let's begin in the fog-draped England of the 13th century, where King Johann the Reckless, known to chroniclers as John Lackland, ruled from 1199 to 1216, a monarch whose reign was less a governance and more a tapestry of missteps, each thread woven with scandal that left even the most hardened nobles clutching their goblets in dismay. Picture a grand banquet hall in Winchester, its high ceilings lost in shadow, the long tables laden with platters of roasted boar, glistening pheasant, and pitchers of honeyed mead, their golden contents catching the flicker of 100 candles. The air is thick with the aroma of spiced meat, the faint dampness of stone walls chilled by an English autumn, and the nervous hum of conversation among lords and ladies who know their king too well. Johann sits at the head, his crown slightly askew, his velvet robes brushing the floor, his eyes not fixed on matters of state or the looming wars across the channel, but on the noble women seated among the crowd, their silken gowns shimmering in the firelight. His smile sharp and knowing sends a ripple of unease through the room, for Johann was not a king who ruled with wisdom, but one who governed with desire, turning every royal visit into a stage for flirtation that teetered on the edge of danger. Chroniclers of the time, men accustomed to recording battles and betrayals without a flinch, chose their words carefully when describing Johann's habits, noting that he was not temperate with women, a delicate phrase that barely veiled the truth. He was a king who saw the wives and daughters of his nobles as prizes to be claimed, not guests to be honored. Imagine a lord, his face pale, his fingers tightening around his wife's wrist as Johann's gaze lingers too long, his voice too smooth as he offers a toast in her name. The king's method was as bold as it was brazen. He would invite a noblewoman to his castle, not for diplomacy but for dalliance, keeping her in lavish chambers surrounded by tapestries and furs until her family paid a ransom, or more often looked the other way in silent fury. One baron, it's whispered in the chronicles, went so far as to fortify his manor before a royal visit, locking gates and barring windows, as if preparing for a siege, not against an army, but against the king's wandering hands and relentless charm. The court buzzed with tales of at least 30 mistresses, a number that suggests not a romantic heart, but a chaotic ledger, as if Johann were managing a roster of conquests rather than a kingdom teetering on the brink of revolt. His strategy was as cunning as it was cruel: seduce a nobleman's wife, provoke the husband's rage, then impose crushing taxes or demand loyalty to soothe the slighter. Cycle that funded his failing wars in France but stoked the fires of rebellion at home. Picture the scene: a feast in progress, the clatter of silver plates, the soft strum of a lute in the corner, yet the air is heavy with tension. Every lord watching his wife, every lady averting her eyes from the king's grin. Servants move silently, avoiding Johann's notice, knowing that even a glance could draw his attention to their mistress. Johann, blissfully unaware of the resentment simmering around him, penned letters in the flickering light of his private chambers, boasting of his conquests with the confidence of a poet who believed his own verses. These letters, preserved in dusty archives, reveal a man convinced he was irresistible, a delusion that blinded him to the growing discontent of his court. Imagine a nobleman summoned to dine with the king, arriving with his wife in tow, her gown carefully chosen to avoid notice, yet knowing no fabric could shield her from Johann's whims. The chronicles tell of one lord who refused to attend unless his household was secured, his daughters hidden, his wife flanked by guards of precaution. That spoke not of mistrust in his family, but of the king who ruled them. Johann's scandals were not mere gossip, they were political dynamite, each affair eroding the fragile loyalty of his barons, who already chafed under his military failures and heavy taxes. The loss of Normandy, a blow to England's pride, was less galling to some than the indignity of a king who treated their families as pawns in his personal games. Picture a council meeting, the air thick with the scent of wax and ink, where barons argued over war strategies while casting wary glances at the king, wondering which of their wives he'd summon next. Johann's reign was a masterclass in self-inflicted wounds, his obsession with pleasure undermining the very power he sought to wield. The Magna Carta, that famed document of 1215, was not just a demand for fair governance. It was a cry from men tired of a king who saw their honor as negotiable. Imagine the moment, a muddy field at Runnymede, the barons standing firm, their swords sheathed but their resolve sharp, as Johann, cornered, affixed his seal to a parchment that would outlive him. Yet even this historic act couldn't erase the whispers of his personal betrayals. The noble women who returned to their families changed, the husbands who paid in gold or silence to reclaim them. The court was a theatre of mistrust, every banquet a potential trap, every royal invitation a test of loyalty or endurance. Picture a lady, her hands trembling as she adjusts her veil, knowing the king's summons could mean days or weeks away from home, her family left to negotiate her return. Johann's ledger of lovers, if it existed, was less a romantic diary than a tally of his own recklessness, each name a spark that threatened to ignite a rebellion. The chroniclers, bound by decorum, wrote sparingly of these affairs, but their restraint only amplified the scandal, their words hinting at a king who treated love as conquest, leaving a trail of broken alliances and whispered airs. Imagine a quiet village far from the court, where a child with the king's sharp eyes grows up in secrecy, their existence a rumor never confirmed. Johann's reign ended in 1216, not with a glorious battle or a noble sacrifice, but with a kingdom fractured, its lords united more by their distrust of him than by any love for England. His death, likely from dysentery or poisoned ale, was almost a relief to those who'd endured his rule, though the chronicles note it with the same dry detachment they used for his life. Picture his final moments, a dimly lit chamber, the air heavy with the scent of sickness and candle wax, as Johann, perhaps still dreaming of his next conquest, slipped away, leaving a legacy of chaos, and a crown no one envied. The Magna Carta endured a monument to the barons' defiance, but the whispers of Johann's scandals lingered longer, carried on the wind through England's halls, a cautionary tale of a king who ruled with his heart and lost his kingdom. As the echoes of his court fade, the clink of goblets softening into silence, the scent of meat dissolving into the cool night air, we turn from this reckless king to another, one whose mind was as fragile as the glass he feared he was made of, a ruler whose reign was a dance between madness and tragedy, waiting to unfold in the courts, a France. As the echoes of King Johann's chaotic court fade into the misty English night, the scent of mead and the clatter of goblets dissolving into silence, we drift across the channel to the opulent palaces of France, where another king's story unfolds, one woven with threads of madness, scandal, and a peculiar fear of breaking. Picture a grand hall in Paris, its high windows letting in slivers of moonlight, the air heavy with the fragrance of polished wood and melting wax from 100 dripping candles. It's the late 14th century, and Charles the Fragile, known to history as Charles VI of France, reigns from 1380 to 1422, a king who began with the promise of youth and ended in a haze of delusion, his mind as brittle as the glass he believed he was made of. Imagine him seated on a velvet cushioned throne, his golden crown gleaming, his hands trembling not from the weight of power but from a terror only he could see. The court around him hums with cautious whispers, lords and ladies exchanging glances, unsure whether to pity or fear their king, whose once sharp eyes now dart nervously, as if a single misstep might shatter him into 1,000 pieces. Chroniclers of the time, their quills scratching late into the night, wrote of a ruler whose reign was a tapestry of brilliance and breakdown, A man who could charm a room one day and flee from his own reflection the next. Let's settle deeper into our blankets, the soft glow of this tale wrapping around us, as we wander through the strange and scandalous world of Charles the Fragile, a king whose heart still found room for love amid his fractured mind. Charles began his reign as a beacon of hope, a boy king crowned at 11, his golden hair and bright smile promising a golden age for France. Picture him in those early years, riding through Paris on a white horse, his cape billowing, the crowds cheering for a ruler they believed would heal a nation torn by war and plague. The 100 Years' War with England cast a long shadow, but young Charles, guided by regents, seemed poised to steer France towards stability. Yet, as he grew, something shifted like a crack spreading through a stained glass window. By his 20s, his mind began to unravel, moments of clarity giving way to episodes where he forgot his own name, his crown, even his kingdom. Imagine him pacing the stone corridors of the Palais de la Cite, his footsteps echoing, his voice low and frantic, insisting he was not Charles, not a king, but a man named George, or perhaps no one at all. His courtiers, dressed in rich velvets, stood frozen, unsure whether to nod or flee, as he ordered them to wrap him in blankets to cushion him, for he believed, with unshakable certainty, that his body was made of glass. Picture the scene, a royal chamber filled with the scent of lavender and wax, servants piling woolen quilts around their king, his eyes wide with fear that a sudden move might crack his fragile form. He refused baths, not out of neglect but terror, convinced that water would dissolve him, that a mirror's reflection might reveal a fracture he couldn't see. The court, accustomed to pomp and protocol, became a theatre of absurdity, with knights instructed to walk softly, lest their boots startle the king into believing he'd shattered. Yet, amid this madness, Charles found time for scandal, his heart as restless as his mind. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, a woman of sharp wit and sharper ambition, bore the weight of a kingdom while her husband drifted into delusion. Imagine her dark hair pinned beneath a jeweled headdress, her lips tight with frustration, managing diplomats and generals as Charles hid from his own shadow. Isabeau was no mere bystander. She negotiated treaties, raised armies, and bore 12 children, though whether all were conceived in Charles's fleeting moments of lucidity remains a whisper among historians. Picture her in a candlelit council room, her voice steady as she placates angry nobles, while in the next chamber, Charles mutters about his glassy limbs. Into this chaos stepped Odette de Tam, a young woman brought to court under the delicate title of companion, though the court's raised eyebrows told another story. Imagine her, soft-spoken, her hands steady as she brushes Charles's hair, her presence calming the king when no one else could. She was no mere mistress, she was a necessity, a soothing anchor in a storm of paranoia. Picture her sitting by his bedside, the room warmed by a crackling fire, as she humors his fears, nodding as he speaks of invisible cracks dressing him in padded garments, as if preparing a knight for a battle against his own mind. Odette's role was whispered about in the halls, her influence a quiet scandal. For while Isabeau ruled the kingdom, Odette ruled the king's fragile heart. The court, already strained by war and taxes, buzzed with gossip, servants carrying tales of the king's padded robes and Odette's late-night vigils, their voices low to avoid the queen's sharp ears. But Charles's reign wasn't just a private drama of delusion and devotion. It was punctuated by a public catastrophe that burned itself into history. Picture a grand ballroom in 1393, the air alive with the scent of wine and perfume, the walls draped with tapestries of mythical beasts. Charles, in a rare moment of enthusiasm, decided to entertain his court with a masquerade. The Bal des Ardents, a dance of wild men. Imagine the scene, the king and 5 noblemen dressed in costumes of flax and pitch, their bodies matted with hair to mimic savage creatures, their laughter echoing as they danced under the glow of torches. The court clapped, delighted by the spectacle, until a spark, perhaps from a careless torch-bearer, fell upon the dancers. The room erupted in chaos, flames leaping up the costumes, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning pitch and screams of agony. Charles, spared by a quick-thinking duchess who smothered the flames with her skirts, survived. But 4 of his companions perished, their deaths a grim spectacle that turned merriment into mourning. Picture the aftermath, the hall silent but for the crackle of dying embers, the court staring at their king, now not just fragile in mind but tainted by disaster. The chroniclers, their quills trembling, called it a divine warning, a sign that France's king was as dangerous as he was delicate. The Bal des Ardents became a scandal that outlived the flames, a story whispered in taverns and courts, a reminder that even in celebration, Charles's reign courted ruin. Yet, despite his madness, Charles's legacy was not barren. He fathered 12 children, their names etched in records though some were born in shadows, their paternity questioned by a court that doubted the king's clarity. Imagine Isabeau, exhausted, signing decrees while her children played in the palace gardens, their laughter a fleeting echo of normalcy in a reign defined by chaos. Charles's episodes grew worse, his glass delusion giving way to darker fears. At times he attacked his own knights, mistaking them for enemies, his sword flashing in a frenzy before collapsing in confusion. Picture his guards, their armor clanking softly, restraining their king with gentle hands, their loyalty tested by a ruler who could not trust himself. The court adapted, building a world around Charles's fears. Servants trained to avoid sudden movements, mirrors banished from the palace. Even the clink of goblets muted to keep the king calm. Odette, ever present, became a fixture, her quiet presence a balm, though her role sparked whispers of scandal that reached even the queen's ears. Isabeau, pragmatic and proud, tolerated Odette, perhaps because she eased the burden of a husband who could no longer rule. Imagine the queen, her gown rustling as she walks through the palace, passing Odette without a word, their shared silence a testament to the strange balance of power in a court, ruled by a fragile king. France itself suffered under Charles's reign, the 100 Years' War draining its coffers, the nobility fracturing into factions as the king drifted in and out of lucidity. Picture the countryside, villages smouldering from English raids while in Paris. Charles sat wrapped in blankets, oblivious to the treaties Isabeau signed in his name. The court became a chessboard, with Isabeau and her allies moving pieces to keep the kingdom intact, while Charles, when lucid, issued erratic decrees that baffled his advisors. One day he might demand a feast, the next he'd lock himself in a tower, convinced his bones were cracking. The chroniclers, their pages filled with careful words, noted the king's malady with a mix of pity and frustration. Their accounts a delicate dance around a truth too stark to name outright. Their king was mad, and his madness was a scandal in itself. Yet, there were moments of tenderness. Imagine Charles in a rare clear hour, sitting with Odette by a fire, his voice soft as he speaks of his children, perhaps unaware of how many he truly had. The court, for all its chaos, carried on, its rituals of banquets and councils a facade to mask a kingdom crumbling. Under the weight of a king who could not bear his own, the Bal des Ardents lingered in memory, its flames a metaphor for a reign that burned bright and then collapsed into ash. Picture the courtiers, years later, recounting the tale in hushed tones, the scent of smoke still vivid in their minds, the image of their king, saved but stained, dancing in a costume that nearly consumed him. Charles's children, some destined for greatness, others lost to history, grew up in a court where madness was as much a ruler as their father. Isabeau, her patience worn thin, became the true power, her decisions shaping France while Charles drifted through his padded world. Odette, ever loyal, remained until the end, her role a quiet scandal that faded into the larger tragedy of the king's life. As Charles's reign drew to a close in 1422, France was a patchwork of rivalries and war, its king a figure of pity more than power. Picture his final days, a darkened chamber, the air heavy with the scent of herbs meant to soothe a mind long lost, his crown set aside, no longer needed by a man who believed he was glass. His death was a whisper, not a roar, a king slipping away as quietly as his sanity had years before. The chroniclers closed their books on Charles the Fragile, their final words a mix of sorrow and relief, a kingdom ready to move beyond a reign defined by delusion and disaster. As the candles in that Parisian palace flicker out, the soft rustle of royal robes fading into the night, we turn from this fragile king to another, one whose passion burned as fiercely as Charles's fears, a ruler in the sunlit courts of Castile where love and vengeance danced a deadly waltz. As the flickering candles of Charles the Fragile's Parisian court dim into the night, the soft rustle of royal robes fading into a whisper of tragedy, we cross the sea to the sun-scorched lands of Castile, where a different kind of fire burned, not in madness but in passion, fierce and unyielding. Picture a sprawling palace in Seville, its courtyards alive with the scent of orange blossoms, the air warm with the glow of a Spanish summer in the mid-14th century. Here, from 1350 to 1369, Pedro the Passionate, known to history as Peter the Cruel or sometimes Peter the Just, ruled with a heart that blazed like the midday sun, his love as dangerous as his sword. Imagine him lounging on a cushioned throne, his dark eyes sharp beneath a crown studded with rubies, the faint clink of armor from his guards mingling with the strum of a lute in the distance. The court buzzes with life, servants carrying trays of figs and wine, noble women in flowing silks casting cautious glances. For Pedro was a king whose desire shaped his kingdom, turning love into a weapon and loyalty into a battlefield. Chroniclers of the time, their quills scratching under flickering lamplight, wrote of a ruler whose reign was a storm of devotion and destruction, a man who loved with such intensity that it scorched everyone around him. Settle deeper into your blankets, let the warm breeze of Castile carry you, as we drift into the scandalous, fiery world of Pedro the Passionate, a king whose heart wrote his legacy in blood and tears. Pedro ascended the throne at 15, a young man with a warrior's build and a lover's soul, his reign beginning in a Castile torn by rivalries and ambition. Picture him in his early years, riding through the dusty plains, his armor gleaming, his banners snapping in the wind, a king who promised to unite a fractured land. Yet, his heart was not with his crown or his council, it was with Maria di Padilla, a noblewoman whose beauty and wit captivated him from the moment they met. Imagine her, standing in a garden of jasmine, her dark hair catching the sunlight, her laughter a melody that drowned out the murmurs of courtly politics. Maria was no mere mistress, she was Pedro's obsession, the center of his world, a flame that burned so brightly it cast shadows over his official wife, Blanca of Bourbon. Picture Blanca, a French princess arriving in Castile in 1353, her dowry heavy with gold, her hopes high for a royal marriage that would bind to nations. The court prepared a grand wedding, the air thick with the scent of roses and incense, the cathedral echoing with hymns. But 3 days after the vows, Pedro turned his back on Blanca, his heart already claimed by Maria. Imagine the shock rippling through the court, the whispers of nobles, as Blanca, still in her wedding silks, was escorted to a castle in Toledo not as a queen, but as a prisoner, her chambers comfortable, but her freedom gone. Pedro's decision was not just a personal slight, it was a political earthquake, alienating France and enraging Blanca's allies, who saw her confinement as an insult to their honor. Picture her in that tower, her window overlooking the Tagus River, her days spent in solitude, her gown gathering dust as she waited for a husband who never came. Meanwhile, Maria di Padilla held court in Seville, her presence a constant beside Pedro, her laughter echoing through the palace halls. The chroniclers, careful not to offend a king with a quick temper, noted that Pedro loved Maria with a fervor that defied custom. Some even whispered of a secret marriage, a ceremony hidden from the court but binding in his heart. Imagine the scene, a moonlit chapel, the air heavy with the scent of wax and myrrh, as Pedro and Maria exchanged vows, their hands clasped, their eyes locked, the world outside forgotten. Maria bore him for children, their names recorded with pride, and when she died in 1361, Pedro's grief was a spectacle. He wept for days, his court draped in black, his decrees proclaiming her his true queen, as if death could rewrite history. Picture him standing by her tomb, his crown set aside, his voice breaking as he swore to honor her forever. promise that would shape the rest of his reign. But Pedro's passion was not gentle. It was a wildfire, consuming friends and foes alike. His love for Maria fueled scandals that shook Castile. His court a stage for drama that rivaled any troubadour's tale. Imagine a banquet, the tables laden with roasted lamb and pomegranates, the air alive with music and laughter, yet beneath it all, a current of fear. Pedro's mistresses, though none outshone Maria, were numerous, their names whispered in the shadows of the palace. One, Dona Juana de Castro, fought to secure his heart after Maria's death, found herself married to Pedro in a fleeting ceremony, only to be cast aside when his mood shifted. Picture her wedding veil still fresh, standing in a courtyard as Pedro rode off, her hopes crumbling like the dust beneath his horse's hooves. Another mistress, caught defying his will, met a darker fate. Her end so grim the chroniclers dared not linger on the details, only hinting at a king whose love could turn to vengeance in a heartbeat. Imagine Pedro on a balcony, sipping wine, his eyes cold as he watched an execution below. A mistress or a rival meeting their end, the crowd silent but for the crackle of torches. His court was a labyrinth of loyalty and betrayal, every noble weighing their allegiance against the risk of crossing a king, who ruled with both passion and a blade. Pedro's enemies grew, not just from his romantic entanglements but from his brutal justice. He earned the title Peter the Cruel for a reason, his reign marked by swift, merciless punishments. Picture a rival noble, summoned to court, arriving with a retinue of guards, only to find himself seized, his lands confiscated, his life ended by Pedro's order. The chroniclers tell of a king who once invited a guest to dinner, the table set with silver and spice, only to have him arrested mid-meal, a public lesson in obedience. Yet, Pedro's supporters called him Peter the Just, claiming his severity was necessary to tame a rebellious Castile, their voices loud in his defense but drowned out by the growing chorus of his foes. Imagine the tension, a council chamber filled with the scent of ink and fear, as nobles debated in hushed tones, knowing Pedro's spies were never far. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, watched from the shadows, his own ambition sharpening with every scandal Pedro ignited. Picture Henry, his armor polished but his heart dark, plotting in a distant castle, his whispers gathering allies who tired of Pedro's chaotic rule. Maria de Padilla's death left Pedro unmoored, his passion turning inward, his decisions erratic. He declared her children his heirs, a move that enraged Blanca's supporters and deepened the court's divide. Imagine a proclamation read in the plaza, the crowd murmuring as Pedro's voice, carried by a herald, insisted Maria was his true queen, her memory a shield against his critics. Blanca, still confined, became a symbol of his betrayal, her plight a rallying cry for those who sought to unseat him. Picture her, years into her captivity, her once bright eyes dulled, her letters to France smuggled out by loyal maids, begging for rescue that never came. Pedro's reign became a dance of love and death, each step more perilous than the last. He fought wars to hold his throne, his armies clashing with rebels and foreign foes, the fields of Castile stained with blood. Imagine a battlefield at dawn, the air thick with the smell of earth, and iron, Pedro at the head, his sword raised, his heart still burning for Maria even as he cut down his enemies. His court, once vibrant with feasts and music, grew grim, the laughter replaced by suspicion, the wine soured by fear. Picture a late-night gathering, the torches burning low as Pedro toasted his loyalists, unaware that some raised their goblets with hands already pledged to his brother. The chroniclers, their pages heavy with the weight of his deeds, wrote of a king who could charm a room but not a kingdom, his passion a flame that warmed few and burned many. Pedro's end came in 1369, not in a grand battle but in a moment of betrayal. Picture a tent on a muddy field, the air cold, the tension thicker than the fog outside. Henry, his half-brother, faced him, their words sharp, their blades sharper. The chroniclers differ on the details, some say Pedro fought bravely, others that he pleaded, but all agree that Henry's dagger found its mark, ending Pedro's reign in a pool of blood. Imagine the silence that followed, the tent empty, but for the fallen king, his crown rolling into the dirt, his passion extinguished at last. Castile mourned or rejoiced, depending on who you asked, but the court felt a collective sigh. The weight of a turbulent reign lifted. Pedro's legacy was a fractured kingdom, his love for Maria a story that outlived him, whispered in taverns and sung by poets. His children, legitimized by his dying decrees, carried his name forward, but the scars of his rule lingered, a reminder of a king who loved to fiercely and ruled to harshly. Picture his palace in Seville, now quiet, the orange blossoms falling unnoticed. The halls once filled with music now echoing with the ghosts of his scandals. The chroniclers closed their books on Pedro the Passionate, their final words a mix of awe and judgment, a king whose heart was both his crown and his curse. As the warm breeze of Castile fades, the scent of jasmine softening into the cool night air, we turn from this fiery king to another one whose love stirred a different kind of storm. In the misty courts of England, where loyalty and betrayal wove a tale as tragic as it was tender, as the warm breeze of Castile fades, the scent of orange blossoms softening into the quiet of a Spanish night, we sail back across the sea to the misty shores of England, where a different kind of storm brewed, not of fiery passion but of tender devotion, misplaced and perilous. Picture a grand castle in London, its stone walls slick with rain, the air heavy with the scent of wet wool and burning logs from roaring hearths. It's the early 14th century, and Edward the Loveland, known to history as Edward II, reigns. From 1307 to 1327, a king whose heart was as open as his crown was heavy, his love for his favourites a spark that ignited rebellion. Imagine him seated at a banquet, his golden hair catching the torchlight, his laughter bright, but his eyes fixed not on his queen, but on a man at his side, a friend whose presence outshone the court itself. The hall hums with the clatter of plates, the murmur of nobles, their voices low with unease, for Edward was a king who wore his affections boldly, his devotion to his companions a scandal that echoed louder than his decrees. Chroniclers of the time, their quills dipping into ink by candlelight, wrote of a ruler whose reign was a tapestry of loyalty and betrayal, his love a double-edged sword that cut through his kingdom's fragile peace. Settle deeper into your blankets, let the soft patter of English rain guide you, as we drift into the tender, tragic world of Edward the Loveland, a king whose heart led him to ruin. Edward ascended the throne at 23, a tall, handsome prince with a warrior's frame and a poet's soul. His coronation a spectacle of hope for a nation weary from his father's wars. Picture the scene in Westminster Abbey, the air thick with incense, the choirs hymns soaring as Edward's crown is placed, its weight a promise of strength. The court expected a king to rival his father, Edward I, the hammer of the Scots. But Edward II was different, his heart drawn not to conquest, but to companionship. His gaze fixed on Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight who'd been his friend since boyhood. Imagine Piers, his dark eyes gleaming, his doublet adorned with jewels that outsparkled the queen's, standing too close to the king at the coronation feast. The nobles, their faces stiff with protocol, watched in horror as Edward lavished Piers with honours, granting him lands, titles, and a seat at the royal table, a place that should have been Queen Isabella's. Picture Isabella, a French princess of 12, her delicate features framed by a golden veil, her dowry a bridge to peace with France, yet her presence overshadowed by Piers, who strutted through the court like a second king. The chroniclers, careful not to offend, noted that Edward's affection for Piers was unseemly. Their words a veil over whispers of a bond too deep for custom. Imagine the banquet hall, the air rich with the scent of roasted swan and spiced wine, as Edward laughs with Piers, their hands brushing as they share a goblet, the court size narrowing with every gesture. Piers was no mere favourite, he was Edward's obsession, a man whose charm and wit held the king's heart in a way his queen never could. The nobles, already bristling from Edward's neglect of state affairs, saw Piers as a threat, a low-born knight who wielded power through the king's affection. Picture a council meeting, the air heavy with the smell of parchment and wax, As barons argue over war with Scotland, their voices sharp, their glances darting to Piers, who lounges with a smirk, his influence undeniable. Edward, blind to their resentment, showered Piers with gifts, castles in Cornwall, estates in Gascony, even the royal jewels meant for Isabella. Imagine her, young but sharp, watching from her throne, her fingers tightening on her goblet as Piers wears a brooch that was her wedding gift. The court buzzed with scandal, servants whispering in the corridors, their trays of bread and cheese forgotten as they recounted the king's latest indulgence. The nobles' patience snapped, and in 1308 they forced Piers into exile, banishing him to Ireland with threats of death if he returned. Picture Edward, his face pale, standing at a castle window, the rain streaking the glass as he watches Piers's ship fade into the mist, his heart heavy with a grief that baffled his advisors. But Edward's love was defiant. He recalled Piers within a year, welcoming him back with a feast that rivaled a coronation, the hall alive with music, the tables groaning under platters of venison and fruit. Imagine the nobles, their jaws tight, as Piers resumes his place at Edward's side, his laughter louder than the lutes, his confidence a slap to their honor. The chroniclers wrote of barons who refused to attend court, their absence a silent protest. But Edward, lost in his devotion, saw only Piers. The scandal deepened, not just because of love, but because of power. Piers governed through Edward, issuing orders, granting favors, his influence a shadow over the crown. Picture a tournament, the air thick with the smell of horses and polished steel, where Piers, not Edward, is cheered by the king's men, the crowd's murmurs turning to shouts of discontent. The nobles, led by the powerful Earl of Lancaster, struck in 1312, seizing Piers and executing him on a lonely hill, his death swift but brutal, a warning to the king. Imagine Edward, his chambers dark, his cries echoing as he mourns, his robes black, his crown discarded, his grief a public spectacle that shocked the court. The chroniclers, their pages stained with ink, called it a king's folly, a love that cost a man his life and a kingdom its stability. But Edward's heart did not learn. He soon turned to another favorite, Hugh Despenser, a man as ambitious as Piers was charming. Picture Hugh, his eyes calculating, his voice smooth as he steps into the void left by Piers, his presence a new spark in Edward's court. Hugh was no mere companion. He was a strategist, his influence colder, sharper, turning the court into a chessboard where he moved the pieces. Imagine a council chamber, the air heavy with tension as Hugh whispers to Edward, his hand on the king's arm, while nobles grit their teeth, their loyalty strained. Isabella, now a young woman, her beauty sharpened by years of neglect, watched Hugh with a gaze that turned from hurt to ice. Picture her, her gown rustling as she paces her chambers, her maid silent as she pens letters to allies in France, her heart hardening into resolve. Hugh's rise brought new scandals. He amassed wealth, seized lands, and alienated even those loyal to Edward, his greed a contrast to Piers's flamboyance. Imagine a feast, the tables laden with pheasant and almonds where Hugh sits at Edward's right, his voice cutting through the music, his enemies plotting in the shadows. The court, once vibrant, grew grim, the laughter replaced by whispers of rebellion, the wine soured by fear. Isabella, scorned and sidelined, became the storm center, her alliance with Roger Mortimer. A noble exiled by Hugh, a scandal in itself. Picture them, meeting in secret in France, the air thick with the scent of ink and treason, their plans a web that would ensnare a king. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer invaded England, their banners flying, their army small but fierce. Imagine Edward fleeing London, his crown heavy, his heart heavier, as he realizes Hugh cannot save him. The nobles, tired of a king who loved too fiercely and ruled too weakly, abandoned him, their castles opening to Isabella's forces. Picture Edward, captured in a rain-soaked forest, his robes muddy, his eyes searching for Hugh, who was soon executed, his death a brutal echo of Piers's. Edward's end was darker, imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, his fate sealed by whispers of a gruesome death, perhaps by a red-hot poker. though the chroniclers hesitate, their words vague, their quills trembling at the horror. Imagine his final moments, a cold cell, the air damp with the smell of stone in despair, as Edward, stripped of his crown, fades into history. His love for his favourites a flame that burned out too soon. The court mourned, or perhaps sighed in relief, as Isabella and Mortimer took power. Their rule a brief shadow before Edward's sun rose to reclaim the throne. Picture Westminster, now quiet, the torches dim. The echoes of Edward's laughter replaced by the footsteps of a new king. The chroniclers closed their books on Edward the Loveland, their words a mix of pity and judgment. A king whose heart was his undoing, his love a scandal that toppled a throne. His legacy lingered in whispers, tales of a king who loved too deeply, whose favourites outshone his crown, and whose fall was as tender as it was tragic. As the reign of England softens into a gentle patter, the scent of wet wool fading into the night, we turn from this heartbroken king to a brotherhood, whose faith and power shaped a different kind of legend, one forged in the dust of the Holy Land, where vows of poverty met the weight of gold. As the soft patter of English rain fades, the scent of wet wool and the echoes of Edward the Loveland, as tragic court dissolving into the night, we journey far from the misty isles to the sun-scorched sands of the Holy Land, where a brotherhood bound by faith and steel carved a legend that still whispers through the ages. Picture a dusty road in Jerusalem, the air thick with the smell of baked earth and myrrh, the horizon shimmering under a relentless sun. It's the early 12th century, and the Templar Brotherhood, known to history as the Knights Templar, emerges from 1119 to 1314, a group of warrior monks whose vows of poverty and piety clashed with a legacy of power and betrayal. Imagine them, 9 knights in borrowed armor, their white mantles stained with the grit of the desert, standing guard over pilgrims on the perilous paths to holy sites. Their red crosses gleam in the sunlight, their swords sheathed but ready, their faces weathered by faith and purpose. The court of Jerusalem hums with the clamour of merchants and the chants of priests. But these knights, sworn to protect, are a quiet force, their presence a shield against the dangers of a war-torn land. Chroniclers of the time, their quills scratching in the dim light of monasteries, wrote of a brotherhood that rose from humble beginnings to a financial empire, only to fall under the weight of greed and fear. Settle deeper into your blankets. Let the warm desert breeze carry you as we drift into the sacred, scandalous world of the Templar Brotherhood, whose faith shaped their rise and whose power sealed their doom. The Templars began in 1119, founded by Hugh de Payens, a knight who saw the dangers faced by pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem after the First Crusade. Picture him kneeling in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the air heavy with incense, his voice low as he vows to protect the faithful with nothing but his sword and his faith. His band of 9 knights, poor and unassuming, lived like monks, their days spent in prayer, their nights guarding dusty trails. Imagine them at dawn, their breath visible in the cool desert air, their horses snorting softly as they patrol the roads, their white mantles a beacon to weary travelers. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ, their poverty a badge of honor. Their quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, believed to be the site of Solomon's temple, giving them their name. By 1129, their mission caught the eye of Bernard of Clairvaux, a powerful cleric whose words carried weight across Christendom. Picture him, his robes plain, but his voice commanding, preaching at the Council of Troyes, securing the Templars' status as a holy order. The Church granted them privileges they answered only to the Pope. Their red cross as symbol of divine protection. Imagine their ranks swelling, noblemen joining, their vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience binding them like iron. Donations poured in, gold from kings, land from lords. Their commanderies sprouting across Europe and the Holy Land like stars in a desert sky. Picture their castles, safed in Bagras, their stone walls rising from the earth, their halls filled with the clank of armor and the murmur of Latin prayers. The Templars were no longer just protectors, they were warriors. Their charges in battles like the Second Crusade legendary, their discipline unmatched. Imagine them on the battlefield, their white mantles splattered with blood, their swords flashing as they ride against Saracen armies. never retreating unless outnumbered 3-1. Their courage was a hymn sung by pilgrims who reached Jerusalem safely, their names whispered in awe by those who saw their banners fly. But the Templars' story was not just one of faith and steel, it was one of wealth, a scandal that grew with their power. Picture their commanderies, not just fortresses but banks, their vaults filled with gold, their ledgers tracking the wealth of kings and nobles. They invented letters of credit, allowing pilgrims to travel without coin. Their system a marvel that made them indispensable. Imagine a knight, his armor dented, handing a parchment to a Templar scribe, receiving funds in Paris for gold deposited in Jerusalem, a transaction as smooth as a prayer. Their wealth grew, estates in France, vineyards in Spain, their influence stretching from London to Acre. Kings borrowed from them, popes trusted them, and their independence, answering only to the Vatican, made them untouchable, or so they thought. Picture a grand hall in Paris, the air rich with the scent of wax and parchment. As Templar officials count coins, their white mantles now embroidered with gold, their vows of poverty a distant memory. The chroniclers, their pages heavy with admiration, noted their financial prowess, but also whispered of pride, of a brotherhood grown too powerful for its own good. Their castles, once austere, became palaces, their tables laden with fine wine and roasted game, their humility eroded by the weight of their wealth. Imagine a Templar knight, his sword still sharp, but his mantle now silk, riding through a village where peasants stared, half in awe, half in envy. The court of Europe watched, some with gratitude, others with greed, none more so than King Philip IV of France, whose debts to the Templars grew as heavy as his ambition. Picture Philip, his eyes cold, his crown gleaming, sitting in a candlelit chamber, his advisors whispering of the Templars' gold, their independence a thorn in his side. By 1307, Philip's patience snapped, his treasury empty, his pride wounded by a brotherhood that answered to no king. Imagine the dawn of Friday, October 13th, a date that would echo through history, as royal guards stormed Templar commanderies across France, their boots thundering on stone floors, their swords drawn. Picture the knights, roused from prayer, their faces stunned as they dragged from their halls, accused of heresy, idol worship, and crimes too dark to name. The chroniclers, their quills trembling, recorded the charges, spitting on crosses, worshipping a mysterious head, sins whispered to inflame the faithful. Imagine the Templars, their vows of silence broken under torture, their confessions coerced by fire and chain, their voices echoing in damp dungeons. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, a grizzled warrior, stood firm at first, his white beard stained with sweat, his eyes defiant as he faced Philip's inquisitors. Picture him, bound in a cell, the air thick with the smell of blood and fear, refusing to confess until pain broke his resolve. The trials were a spectacle, the court of Paris alive with the murmur of crowds, the scent of burning wood as pyres were prepared. In 1314, Jacques de Molay faced his end, tied to a stake on an island in the Seine, the flames licking his mantle as he cursed Philip and Pope Clement V, swearing they'd face divine judgment within a year. Imagine the crowd, their breath caught as his voice rose above the crackle, a prophecy that chilled the air. Philip died months later, Clement soon after, their deaths fueling whispers of a Templar curse, a legend that outlived their order. Picture the aftermath, Templar castles emptied, their gold vanished, their commanderies silent but for the wind. The chroniclers, their pages heavy with tragedy, wrote of a brotherhood betrayed, their wealth scattered, their legacy a mix of myth and fear. Imagine their treasures hidden in tales of secret vaults whispered about in taverns, sought by treasure hunters for centuries. The Templars' red cross faded, but their story lingered, a cautionary tale of faith and power, of vows that could not withstand the greed of kings. Picture their final moments, the flames dying out, the Seine flowing quietly, as the Brotherhood's name became a whisper, a ghost in the annals of history. Their castles stood empty, their mantles folded, their mission a memory carried by the wind. The court of Europe moved on, but the Templars' shadow remained, their curse a story told by firelight, their wealth a dream that haunted the ages. As we close this chapter of Video 1, the dust of the Holy Land settling, the scent of myrrh fading into the cool night air, we thank you for drifting with us through these tales of scandal and sacrifice. If these stories have soothed your night, please like this video, subscribe for more journeys into the past, and share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Rest now, and join us in part 2, where we'll wander through the courts of more kings and a pirate queen whose waves rocked an empire. Their stories waiting to lull you into another peaceful slumber.